In order to understand var, let and const in JavaScript, we have to understand three basic concepts. The first one is hoisting. The second one is temporal dead zone. And the third one is function versus block scope. Let's first get to hoisting and understand how it works. In order to understand hoisting, let's look at a very simple code. I am going to declare a variable here. Let's call this myvar and set its value to 10. And let's use it by displaying its value to the console. Now, if we run this code, it's actually going to work very well. It's going to output the value 10. If you're coming from the languages like C++ or Java, this is how the sequence of a variable and its usage works. You have to declare the variable first and then you can use it. But in JavaScript, we can reverse the sequence. Let's see what happens if I take this line and set it as the second line of the code and then execute this code. You can see that the program ran fine except the value is undefined now. There was no compile time error and there was no runtime exception when I used my variable before declaring it. How is this possible in JavaScript? This is possible because of the hoisting. What JavaScript compiler does is it takes all the declarations, the variables in a function, and takes those declarations to the top of the compilation. However, initializations are kept where they are in the original code. At the time of declaration, undefined is assigned as a value to the hoisted variables. So even if I have other code here, let's say I write my function here and I output something in this function. And then I call this function. And after that I declare another variable. Let's call this my var2 and let's set its value to 20. And I would like to use this my var2 somewhere at the start of this code. When we run this code, it compiles and executes fine. The variables myvar and myvar2 have been hoisted, assigned the value undefined, and accessible before their initialization. Hence, we now understand that hoisting is the process by which variable declarations are moved to the top of their containing scope during the compilation phase, before the code is executed. The same concept applies to function declarations. This allows us to use variables and functions before they are actually declared in the code. Coming towards the temporal death zone, let's get back to our simple code again and see what happens when we convert this var to let. Here again, I am using the same variable, myvar, and I have declared it using the let, and I am utilizing it before its declaration and initialization. Let's see what happens when I run this code. When I run this code, I actually get an exception. Let's see what this exception is. This exception says that it's a reference error, and it says that you cannot access my bar before initialization. Here comes the temporal dead zone concept. When we use var or let, the variable declarations are taken to the top of the code by the compiler. But the associated concept is that the variable initializations are kept where they are. For example, in this code, when I'm using my var and it did not give me a compile time error because the my var declaration was taken to the top of the entire code by the JavaScript compiler. But the my var initialization, which is my var is equal to 10, was kept where it is. The modern JavaScript, which is ECMAScript 6, tells us that we cannot use a variable before it has been initialized if the variable was declared using let. The time between the declaration or hoisting of the variable and its initialization is called temporal death zone. In this time period, you cannot access a variable which has been declared using let. Recall what happened when we actually used var instead of the let? There was no error. For example, if I convert it back to var and run the code, there is no exception. But we can see that there is the output undefined here. It is because when the variables declared with var are hoisted, they are assigned a default value of undefined. But in case of let, this does not happen. In case of the let, the declarations are hoisted by the compiler, but they are not initialized with any default value. Instead, the let variables enter into the temporal dead zone. The variables who are in the temporal dead zone cannot be accessed until they have been initialized. Hence, in order to use myvar variable properly with let, we will have to again rearrange the code and put the usage of the variable after its initialization. If we run this code, it works perfectly fine. Temporal Dead Zone is basically an additional protection layer for the variables in modern JavaScript to reduce the errors caused by undefined default value.
Coming towards the third concept, let's understand the functional versus block scopes and see how let and var behave in these scopes. Let's start with the most straightforward scenario that most of us know about the functions and variables inside them. Let's create a function. Let's call it myFunction. And within this function, we declare a simple variable. Let's say myvar and assign it the value 0. And we know that this variable is not accessible outside the function. So, for example, if I run this, I get an exception. It says that my variable is not defined. This is the simplest case. The same happens if declare the variable myvar with let. And if we run the same function again, we get the same error. And it says that myvar is not defined. This is the first fundamental concept of function scope, which says that the variables are not accessible outside the functions where they are declared. But there is much more to this when we talk about var and let inside the functions. Let's move on and see the differences. I'm going to make a block with an if statement, and let's have another block which is without any condition, and let's try to access a variable which is defined outside of these blocks and defined with the help of var. In JavaScript, a block is a set of statements enclosed within a pair of curly braces. Blocks are used to group multiple statements together into a single code unit. We can call if statements, loop statements, and functions blocks. We can also create blocks explicitly without any condition or loop, often for organizational purposes. So, in this code, I have 3 blocks: myFunction block, and its nested blocks of if condition, and an explicit block without any conditions. I have declared a variable outside the if and explicit block, and accessing it inside these blocks. It does not matter if the variable is defined with var or let, the variable will be accessible inside these blocks. Let's now understand the block scope. Let's declare a variable inside the if block. We will see how the variable accessibility varies when it is declared with let. Let's first see the var behavior, and then we can move to let to better understand it. I have defined my var inside the if condition, and accessing it before the if condition as well as inside the explicit block, which is after the if block and inside a different scope. Now, if I run the code, the var gives undefined when I am accessing it before its declaration, and it gives the value 0 in the explicit block, which was assigned to it in the if block. This gives us a clear understand that var variables are accessible in the entire function irrespective of the defining block. In contrast to this, let variables are only accessible in the block where they are defined. If they are accessed outside the block, the variable inaccessible error comes up. I have changed the var to let in this code. Now let me run the code to show you the error. As you can see here, the error at line 3 of the code states that my var is not defined. Similarly, my var is not defined at line 9 as well because the block scope for the myvar variable allows it to be accessible only in the if block. Coming towards the final concept in this video, let's briefly talk about the const keyword, which is used to declare a variable that cannot be reassigned after its initial value is set. This is in contrast to let and var, which allow reassignment of values. We cannot create a variable with const without initialization. Value of the const variable cannot be changed in the program's entire lifeline. Const behaves exactly like let as it is hoisted and enters the temporal dead zone until it has been initialized. Const has block scope as opposed to the functional scope. Let us now summarize the concepts that we have learned in this video. After hoisting declarations, var variable is assigned a value of undefined until it is initialized, but let variable is not assigned a value. Var variable can be accessed before initialization, but accessing a let variable before initialization throws runtime exception. Var variables are accessible in the entire function, but let variables can only be accessed within the defined block.
Hope you liked the content. Please like, subscribe and hit the bell icon to support our channel. Thanks for being part of our journey.